When the first white settlers came to the area that we now know as Columbia County, the year was 1823. What they saw here was much of what still exists today: crystal clear rivers and streams, thick forest, and an abundance of lakes. 300 years before, the explorer Don Hernando de Soto had passed through the vicinity on his way to the Appalachian Indian towns near what is now present-day Tallahassee. Historians tell us that as late as 1817, there was a small Indian village at the site of our present-day Lake City. The village chief was named Halpater Testanugi, also called Alligator. It is from this chief that the rising settlement would take its name. Columbia County was created on February 4, 1832, and in 1836, the village of Alligator was named the county seat. Chief Alligator was said to have been among the most intelligent of the Seminole chiefs. He spoke English and was friendly with the early settlers. Later, that changed, however, and the chief became embittered against the whites. During the years that followed, local citizens would be forced to abandon their farms and seek shelter at local forts from the warring Seminoles. At the end of the Second Seminole War and upon Florida's admission to the Union, growth and prosperity began to find its way into Columbia County, much of it associated with the expansion of cotton growing. Farmers and plantation owners also grew Cuban tobacco, and livestock and vegetables were also formidable cash industries. By the mid-1850s, residents of the town had grown uneasy with the name Alligator, and a movement was set forth to change it. County Commissioner A.B. Hagan was said to have been instrumental in leading the charge for the name change. In 1858, a legislative bill was introduced by Representative Robert Brown to officially change the name of Alligator to Lake City. Much of what we know today about the history of Columbia County and Lake City comes from first-hand accounts of relatives and acquaintances of the pioneer families. Other sources include old photographs, letters, and stories that still reside in private collections. Two of the most extensive collections are owned, one by Miss Nettie Ozaki and by Mr. George Disbrow of Lake City. One of the descendants of the pioneering Goodbread family, Miss Ozaki, shares with us many memorable stories and anecdotes passed down to her from preceding generations. The producers of this video are grateful for the use of her and Mr. Disbrow's family collection, as well as for Miss Ozaki's narration of parts of this presentation. Come with us now as we share some of those stories, letters, and photographs depicting our home over the past 100 years. One of the earliest photographs was of the home of Colonel A.B. Hagan. Hagan was a county commissioner and an attorney who is said to have led the legal battle to change the name of Alligator to Lake City. The story of why is said to be legend.
Now, the story is told that the reason this all came about is one of our mamas was sending her daughter off to school to college, and she didn't want her daughter to have to be embarrassed by listing her hometown as Alligator, Florida. And so the talk began and the legal battle was won, and the name Alligator left Lake City, and Lake City became Lake City, Florida.
On December 14, 1858, a bill was introduced to change the name of the town of Alligator to Lake City. The city was incorporated as Lake City on January 15, 1859. From the early years, education in Columbia County has always been at the forefront. In the 1870s, Lake City had two public schools, the Peabody Graydon High School and the Finley High School, which was located in the same area as the later Richardson High School. In 1893, a site was purchased on West Duval Street, and the Peabody School was moved to that site. In 1903, the name was changed from Peabody to Columbia Graded and High School. In the early years, agriculture was king in Columbia County. Construction of a railroad that would eventually come through the area had begun before the Civil War. As of December 1859, some 350 miles of road was graded, mostly going east to west across North Florida, with more than 200 miles of track having been laid. By the turn of the century, Lake City was an important rail junction. One of the largest industries in North Florida, the knitting mills of J&P Coates, was located here, and the trains were an important part of Lake City's commerce and trade, hauling everything from timber to the famous Sea Island cotton used by the mill. Lake City and W.B. Babe Douglas would later become an important figure in Florida, serving on the Public Utilities and Railroad Commission of Florida.
We've had generals, we've had ambassadors, we've had college presidents. Our community has not only generated crops, we've generated some leaders and people who've made a real name for themselves throughout the world.
But Babe wasn't the only Lake Cityan to ever figure prominently as a statewide leader. Another Lake Cityan, Fred P. Cone, became governor of Florida and served from 1937 to 1941. Cone was born in 1871 and grew up in the Benton community in the northern part of the county. When Columbia County Bank was first organized in 1912, Cone served as its first president. Later, as president of the Florida Senate, he would lead the fight for a bill that would eventually establish uniform textbooks for every elementary school in Florida. Cone attended Columbia Agricultural College, which was located on the modern-day site of the VA Medical Center. The residents of the county were proud of their college, and in 1901, its future seemed secure. It was then that millionaire Standard Oil man and Florida Railroad promoter Henry Flagler gave $10,000 to the institution for a sorely needed gymnasium. But the story goes, there was more to Flagler's gift than just his patent generosity.
His wife was in a mental institution and he wanted a divorce. But the legislatures were not willing to change statutes just for one man. And the rule said you cannot divorce someone who's insane. He bribed, in essence, from what I am told, who knows what the truth really is, the legislature by saying, I will build a fine building in Lake City, Florida, if you will change the law so that I can divorce my wife and remarry someone else.
Flagler got his wish. The legislature enacted the Flagler divorce law, which allowed divorce on the grounds of insanity. However, it was short-lived. It was repealed in 1905. The college, however, received another boost when in 1903 the legislature changed its name from Columbia Agricultural College to the University of Florida. The glory was short-lived, however, as events were already unfolding that would eventually result in the transfer of the school to Gainesville. After a bitter rivalry between delegates from both Gainesville and Lake City, both sides offering what they felt were substantial packages of cash and real estate, the announcement came early in the morning of July 7, 1905. By a vote of 6-4, Gainesville would become the permanent site of the University of Florida. Columbia Countyans didn't take kindly to the news of the loss of their university. Talk of violence was heard throughout the city, and Teamsters were reluctant to move items to the new Gainesville site. State militia units were readied in anticipation of trouble. General Albert H. Blanding's brother, who was a member of a militia unit, wrote in a note to the general, "The Lake City people are certainly hot, and I expect they will burn everything up. Reports indicate trouble."
And there was a lot of bitterness in the community when that happened. As a matter of fact, when they wanted to get horse and buggies and mules to pull the loads of the books and the equipment down to Gainesville, the farmers here refused to let them use their wagons and their horses.
As it turned out, calm prevailed and there was no violence. At the time it closed, the university had an enrollment of about 350 and a faculty of 25. They even had a football team. But that was not the end. The Florida Baptist Convention, which also had been operating the Lake City Institute, also called Lakeside College, leased the buildings and grounds from Lake City and created Columbia College. Columbia College operated as a church-affiliated private coeducational college from 1907 until 1917. In 1917, Columbia College merged with Stetson University in DeLand, leaving the buildings that once housed students and faculty now vacant. After the end of World War I, the federal government had need to establish more hospitals for war veterans. On January 19, 1920, the Lake City Council proposed to sell the buildings and the land that once comprised Columbia College to the federal government for $75,000. On May 20th, 1920, the first Veterans Hospital in Lake City was established as the United States Health Service Hospital number 63. Over the next 10 years, the facility would undergo several reorganizations and name changes. Finally, though, in 1930, it was reorganized as the Veterans Administration Hospital. None of the original buildings remain today. The old Science Building, which later became the surgical wing of the hospital, was torn down in 1956, and the last of the original buildings, the infamous Flagler Gymnasium, which was used as a recreation center, was demolished in 1960. Today, in their place, stands an ultra-modern, fully equipped and professionally staffed, state-of-the-art hospital facility. 75 years ago, inside, things were just a little bit different.
My father, who's 91 in the year 1995, was an 18-year-old aide at the Veterans Hospital, and he has told me about the nurses that came to treat and heal and deal with the World War I veterans. And the word he used were they were tough cookies. He told me that many of them had been in France, had been on war duty and left the battlefront and returned to America, and then went to veterans hospitals to care for the wounded.
Making the transition from being a college to becoming a veterans hospital was a little difficult too.
The hospital really was not ready for the veterans and the pain and suffering that was brought in for healing. He said he can remember that one time they were going to have an inspection and they thought they'd done everything they could do. But in the middle of one of the rooms where all the patients would sit, he said they didn't have anything but one wash basin and one latrine type place for like 50, 60 patients. But they had a big pot-belly stove in the middle of the room with sand around it in a box. And he said the patients used to sit there and sit around the stove and they'd spit. And if they didn't hit the stove, it would at least fall into the sand. And he said there were rats and roaches and things that you just would hope wouldn't have been in a hospital, but he said they were doing the best they could to take care of the veterans. But when the Inspector General came, they got into the room where there was a bunch of trash by the stove, and the director realized, and he picked it up and tried to walk around the stove as the director went around the other way so that at least he could keep hiding the trash. And the nurse that had failed to get rid of that trash that was around the stove got in a lot of trouble for not getting it ready at least that day for the inspection.
By 1910, Lake City had a population of more than 5,000. It was the 6th largest city in the state. It was also recognized as one of Florida's most progressive cities, with its paved streets, telephones, waterworks, and its own electrical generating plant. In the years between 1900 and 1910, Lake City saw the construction of the Blanche Hotel and a new courthouse, both of which still stand today. But 1910 also ushered in a new era for Lake Cityans with the arrival of the first automobiles. The Blanche was a stately hotel located on Lake City's Main Street, Marion Street. For years, it would be the meeting place of travelers making the 2-day trip between Tallahassee and Jacksonville, Lake City, and the Blanche being the overnight stop. Tourism would soon be a buzzword in Lake City. Local businessmen erected signs along the then dirt roads between Jacksonville, Tallahassee, and the Georgia border proclaiming rest lay just ahead in Lake City. In the mid-1920s, the Lake City Chamber of Commerce opened its office at 6 o'clock in the morning for the start of an 18-hour day. Though most of the travelers were southbound, some paused long enough in Columbia and adjacent counties to visit the local attractions. One of those attractions would be Aunt Aggie's Boneyard. Aunt Aggie and her husband Jinks Jones lived in the northern section of town near where Richardson High School would later be built. Aggie and her husband maintained a garden composed entirely of animal bones that had been wired and fastened together to form elaborate arches, gateways, and trellises for clinging plants and vines. People came from miles around to visit the unique surroundings.
My father knew her. He says that people came from miles and miles and miles around to visit Aunt Aggie, her home, and her boneyard. My dad recalls on Sundays you could get a couple of pennies. You could knock on her door and she'd open it up, and she'd had it. The walls were lined with newspapers and magazine sheets. She'd have little dried bouquets of flowers and all sorts of fascinating things for a kid to see. And they'd give her a couple of pennies and she'd say, "How you children doing? Y'all want to go to Aunt Aggie's boneyard?" And he said they'd go out there to Aunt Aggie's boneyard. They'd have the best time walking up and down the roads of Aunt Aggie's boneyard.
Aunt Aggie's boneyard was quite famous between 1900 and 1918, the year that Aunt Aggie died. And although no one's quite sure when she was born, Aunt Aggie was well into her 90s when she passed away. The latter part of the 19th century through the 1920s would see significant changes in Columbia County. Agriculture, the economic base of the area, would face significant challenges. The bolled weevil first infested the cotton crop in Columbia County right before World War I. The insect was particularly destructive to Sea Island cotton, which was extensively grown in Columbia County. Before that, the Great Freeze of 1894-95 would finish the citrus industry in Columbia County for good. The very next year, a hurricane of 1896 entered at Cedar Key and created a wide swath of destruction through Columbia County. By the end of World War I, local farmers had shifted their attention to other agricultural products, including flue-cured burley tobacco. By the mid-1930s, more than 1 million pounds of flue-cured tobacco were produced in the greater Swanee River Valley. Important marketing warehouses were established in Live Oak and Lake City. Forestry was also becoming an important industry. The soil of Columbia County was well suited for growing the yellow pine, and lumber produced from this product was usually shipped to the northeastern United States and to western Europe and Central America. Proclaimed by the Lake City Chamber of Commerce in 1915 to be Florida's largest lumber mill, was the East Coast Lumber Company located in Watertown. Watertown was virtually a company town, as the lumber company owned the bank, the commissary, and many other facilities. They even minted their own money, which was used by employees to purchase goods. Closely allied with the lumber industry was the naval stores industry. This industry crested in the 1920s with more than 8 distilleries in operation. By the late 1920s and on to the 30s, forest conservation programs were still underway. Landowners were encouraged to participate in reforestation efforts. The U.S. Forest Service was well entrenched in the area, establishing national forests and naval stores research centers, including one in Olustee, Florida. That building now, owned by Lake City Community College, houses the Correction Academy of North Florida. Forestry research brought new jobs and innovative machines. One such machine, the Mathis plow, is used for fire protection in the National Forest. Its designer was Leon Mathis of Lake City. The first plow is currently in the Smithsonian Institution. Social life in the early decades was simple and pleasurable. Popular were church socials and political rallies. The Opera House was used for stage entertainment. And then, like now, the cool, clear waters of the Itchitucknee River or the Swanee River drew Sunday crowds for swimming and picnics.
My father's father was a train conductor on what was known as the Itchitucknee line, and it was not unusual for one of the churches to fill up a whole railroad car, and they would back that car off the tracks and leave it, and the folks would get out and go to Itchitucknee and have church picnics. And my dad talks about how they'd stop the Itchitucknee line and people would get out and buy chinkapins or pick chinkapins on the Itchitucknee line before it got to High Springs. They also talk about how my great-grandfather would stop the train, pull the trigger, get a covey of quail or dove or squirrel, and bring them home when he got back to Lake City at the end of the day of the railroad line day.
Lake DeSoto was also a gathering place for many early social and church events in Lake City.
This lake should tell stories. Many a Sunday morning we would hear the sweet sound of music drifting across this lake. We would look out and one of our Afro-American churches would be having baptisms, and the women would be all in white and the preacher would be down in the water with his suit, and the person being baptized would be there, and they would be singing and baptizing on Lake DeSoto on a Sunday morning.
Even today, Lake DeSoto is a favorite spot for Lake Cityans to gather. It's seen charity walks, bicyclists, and baptisms. The lake is at least as old as the memories of the first settlers, and historians say even beyond that.
That lake has seen Seminole Indians. We found a Seminole Indian canoe abandoned in this lake when it was drained in the 1990s. This lake had Civil War guns thrown into it when the boarding house folks tricked the soldiers into going in and eating while they took the guns and threw them in the lake.
It was 1929 when the Olustee Battle Monument was dedicated at Olustee Park, not far from the banks of the historic Lake DeSoto. The monument paid homage to the sacrifices made at the Battle of Olustee, the state's largest Civil War battle. Then as now, Olustee had a special role in the county. Throughout the 1920s, Lake City experienced population fluctuations and showed some decreases. By the end of the decade, that decline had been checked, but growth was stagnant. Because Lake City did not directly share in the land boom of South Florida, it did not suffer the reversals of fortune when the bubble burst. However, like the rest of the country, Lake City would not escape the ravages of the Great Depression. Southern agriculture in general had been in a state of depression since the early 1920s. Since Columbia County was heavily agricultural dependent for its economy, the Depression years would prove to be most challenging, but not so much as the rest of the state as a whole. While roughly half the state and national banks in Florida failed in the 20s and 30s, only the Watertown Bank in Columbia County failed to reopen. The State Exchange Bank, formed in 1904, the Columbia County Bank, formed in 1912, closed only temporarily. They both survived. The First National Bank remained open throughout the Depression. Organized in 1904, the First National Bank was built on the site historians believe was once Fort Lancaster, a haven of safe shelter for earlier settlers during the Seminole Wars of the 1830s and 40s, and probably even earlier. The original First National Bank building, now restored, still sits in its original location and is occupied by Community National Bank. During the Depression years, federal assistance was meager but welcome. A few WPA projects helped with some jobs and built the National Guard Armory as well as City Hall. For the most part, though, families were encouraged to produce many of the foods and goods they needed. Clothes made from feed sacks were common in the county during this period. The 1930s would also see the election of Fred P. Cone of Lake City as Florida's governor. Cone was considered a fiscal conservative whose platform called for, quote, lowering the budget to balance taxes instead of raising taxes to balance the budget, end of quote. Some historians have criticized the Cone administration, holding that his conservative fiscal policies had adverse effects regarding long-range planning of educational welfare needs for the 40s and 50s. Cone served only one term. By the late 1930s, the Depression was still sorely felt in the county, but there was also hopeful signs that the worst was over. The three banks, First National, State Exchange, and Columbia County, all were reporting increases in assets. Agriculture was still the economic base of the county. Tobacco production in Columbia County steadily increased during the 30s, replacing the once giant cotton crop as king of the hill. In 1938, the Lake City tobacco markets opened, giving local farmers a place to market their crop. In its first year, the Lake City market handled more than 3.5 million pounds of tobacco and was preparing for more than 6 million pounds the second year.
Tobacco was important, and people would talk about their smokehouses where they would smoke the tobacco. And during the, even up in the last few years, during the summer, the farmers would hire young people to work on the farm and do the tobacco, and they would have smokehouses, and the wives would cook great big meals to serve everybody that was working tobacco. And they used to say, "What are you doing this summer? Are you working in tobacco?" And I can remember in some of the North Florida counties, I'm not sure about Columbia, But you just didn't start school until tobacco season was over, because if you did, the children who were working in tobacco would not be there for the first day of school.
If prosperity was returning to Lake City after the Depression years, it would do so just in time for another unfortunate happenstance: World War II. Like every war before it, dating all the way back to the Seminole War, Lake Cityans would respond to the effort by giving up its sons and daughters in the struggle for freedom. All totaled, Lake City sent some 2,000 of its residents to all fronts of the war, certainly a sizable number considering its population. Lake Cityan A.K. Black, then a young attorney, resigned as state attorney, closed his law practice, and became the first public official in the state to enter military service during World War II. On December 8, 1942, a year and a day after Pearl Harbor, the Lake City Naval Air Station was commissioned on the site presently occupied by both Aero Corporation and Lake City Community College. Lake City was one of 11 naval air stations in Florida and provided important training during the war. The war ended in 1945, and in November of that year, the facilities were turned over for civilian use. After the war, Columbia County shared in the growth that the whole state was experiencing, but to a lot lesser extent. There was no boom here. Agriculture was still the largest industry in the county. In the period after the war, tobacco would emerge as the #1 cash crop. By 1964, there would be 3 tobacco warehouses, and the crop would gross more than $1.5 million a year. Forestry would also emerge as a primary industry, creating numerous jobs related to the field. 71% of Columbia County was classified as forest land, so there was a trend toward tree farming and participation in the federal Solid Land Banks program. In 1947, the Forest Ranger School was established and operated as a branch of the University of Florida. The school, located on part of the property that was a naval air station, offered a 1-year course in applied forestry. The downtown area of Lake City was the heart of Columbia County's retail district. Several of the old established businesses would begin to make room for new stores and offices. The Blanche Hotel, constructed in 1901, was one of Lake City's social meeting locations for parties and after-church dining.
I can remember as a child on Sundays after we left church, if we were all dressed up and looked and acted our best, we would go to the Blanche dining room and have lunch on Sundays. Rotary Club used to meet there. Many other clubs would meet there. During tobacco season, mercy me, this is where all the tobacco men would stay. And people would bake a cake and say, "Welcome tobacco men," or tobacco season. You always knew when it was tobacco season at the Blanche Hotel because so many men came in and were residents there during the season.
In the early 1950s, a new phenomenon was emerging: television. First brought to the attention of Lake Cityans in the early 1940s when Cox Furniture had advertised a Philco radio with television sound, few otherwise knew much about the medium. Then a television crew came to Lake City.
Hello friends, once again we're presenting our TV Neighbors film section, and today we're visiting Lake City, Florida. We're located here in the Lusty Park right across from the Columbia County Courthouse. We have a lot of the city dignitaries with us. Of course, the Columbia High School Band is here under the direction of Mr. Albert Sena, and we'll hear from them later on in our program. But first of all, we would like to introduce you to the mayor of Lake City. He's here on the far end. I'm going down the line here and get a brief word from all those represented. Mayor Hagan, it's mighty pleasant to be here.
Well, it's mighty fine to have you people here. On behalf of the city, I'd like to welcome Zenith's traveling TV unit to Lake City. I know it's going to give us a lot of nice publicity, and we're mighty glad to have you people come see us.
Well,
During the 50s and 60s, manufacturing began to take hold in Columbia County. Aero Corporation, located at the old Naval Air Station site, was said to at one time boast of 1,400 employees. Other large manufacturers at the time included Gurdon Industries and Piedmont Mobile Homes, Metal Products Company, which supplied trim parts to the automobile industry, and several timber companies. Another important part of the industrial base, even though it was not located in Columbia County, would be Occidental Petroleum Corporation, located near White Springs. A number of residents of Lake City would find long-term employment at the phosphate mining and production facility. Lake City was also becoming a center for governmental operations. By 1960, the State Road Department, the Florida Forestry Service, Troop B headquarters for the Florida Highway Patrol, the VA Hospital, and the regional headquarters for the Game and Freshwater Fish Commission would all be located here, opening up new growth, new jobs, and new opportunities. By 1961, 32% of the personal income of Columbia County came from employment in governmental agencies, while only 11% came from agriculture. In 1961, the State Board of Education gave priority status to the area of Columbia, Baker, Gilchrist, and Union counties for location of an institution of higher education. In the mid-1950s, Governor Leroy Collins gave high priority to the establishment of a system of two-year community colleges throughout the state, and the board in 1960 thought that the four-county area should receive priority, but the move was opposed by then-Governor Ferris Bryant. However, State Senator G.T. Melton of Columbia County promoted the bill authorizing the college in the legislature, and it passed both houses in May of 1961. Governor Bryant threatened to veto, but relented to let it become law without his signature. The Forest Ranger School was combined with the new Lake City Junior College, and the first students were enrolled for the fall term of 1962. Since then, the college has undergone dynamic growth and a name change, but still has seen only two presidents: the founding president, Herbert E. Phillips, and the current president, Dr. Muriel K. Heimer. In the years between 1960 and 1990, Lake City would be confronted with what seemed to be rapid changes. Downtown, rich in tradition and time, where once big department stores flourished, would begin to dwindle. Empty windows would greet the streets where once visitors from the north strolled, shopped, and dined. North and west of town, the new and progressive interstate highways would now route travelers around rather than through Lake City. The Blanche, which for decades greeted these early, weary travelers and housed and fed them, gave up her cherished guests to a new chain of hotels, Holiday Inn. Other interstate hotels would soon follow. The stately theaters, or picture shows as they were called, with their Saturday nickel matinees and plush balconies, once so much a part of the downtown scene, would also disappear, but not their memories.
If I went to Sunday school on Sunday morning, my mother would let me go to the picture show on Sunday afternoon. And believe you me, I had more religion during those years because I loved the picture shows. And so I made sure I went to Sunday school in the morning so I could go to the picture show on Sunday afternoon.
The 1960s saw the advancement of civil rights in Lake City, and like with other areas of the country, the movement was not always welcome. But local white residents recognized the contributions of many of the local black citizens, and as a result, the transitions that occurred through desegregation seemed to be less painful here than in many other parts of the country. Minnie Jones Neblack was an African-American teacher who helped bring about consolidated schools to the county. During the 1920s, educators as well as the public came to accept the view that small rural schools could not offer a curriculum comparable to a larger facility. So the smaller schools were consolidated into better equipped and better staffed, larger operations. Ms. Neblack donated 10 acres of land to effect the King's Welcome School consolidation. Other notable pioneers included Aunt Aggie and her husband Jinx, who for years brought notoriety to Lake City through their famous boneyard, and Elise Caesar, who was an early proponent of civil rights. In 1969, the Florida Outdoor Recreational Council purchased the land bordering the Ichetucknee River and made it a state park. The river for decades has been one of the top recreational spots of local citizens. Centuries before that, it was the site of the Spanish mission, Santa Catalina. Now it would be preserved forever. The pristine river would bring worldwide recognition once again to Lake City, as National Geographic and other magazines would write of its beauty, and frolickers and college students would come from all over the country to tube down the Ichetucknee. Today, Lake City is changing once again. While some areas are going forward, still others are going backwards, but for all the right reasons. The area between the Highway Patrol Station and the Interstate 75 has filled in dramatically since 1970. Malls, shopping centers, and modern restaurants stand where just a few decades ago, cows grazed. The population of the county is nearing 50,000, and Lake City proper is again going through a metamorphosis. A complete refurbishing of the once proud downtown is sure to resurrect memories of what many of us today would say were simpler times, when Sunday mornings meant a baptism in Lake DeSoto and after church dining was at the Blanche. Yes, we've come full circle. History has a way of doing that. Many of the original descendants of alligators still remain here today. And it is through their stories and folklore that we're able to tell you about the roots from which this community sprang. The trials, the tribulations, the good times and bad, all a part of Columbia County, Alligator, and Lake City throughout the past 100 years.